Hello friends, I am glad you are here tonight. Before we begin, let me ask you something. Where are you listening from, and what time is it for you right now? I always find it fascinating to imagine people scattered across the world, some sitting in quiet bedrooms late at night, others lying down with headphones as the evening drifts closer to midnight, and maybe a few of you listening in the middle of the day, with sunlight still pressing against the window. Wherever you are, I invite you to settle in, relax, and follow me into a story that feels distant and yet strangely close. Imagine France in the early 1940s, a land famous for wine, bread, and art suddenly caught in the weight of occupation. Paris, once the city of light, had gone dim. Cafes still opened their doors, but the conversations whispered inside carried tension. People wondered if the man at the next table was a neighbor, or a collaborator, or perhaps a German soldier in plain clothes. Every choice mattered: what you ate, how you spoke, where you walked, even what you dared to say in public. Bread was no longer simply bread. It became a symbol of survival. The average French family lived with ration cards, little booklets filled with stamps that determined how much flour, butter, sugar, or meat they could claim. But the stamps themselves were rarely enough. Housewives woke before dawn to line up at bakeries, only to return home with a single loaf, gray in color, stretched with strange substitutes. People joked, though never too loudly, that the bread of Paris tasted more like sawdust than wheat. Still, it was bread, and when you are hungry, you swallow the bitterness. And yet, hunger never destroyed the French spirit completely. In the villages, markets continued in secret corners. Farmers hid eggs under baskets of straw, or slaughtered a rabbit and whispered about it to trusted friends. The black market thrived because necessity always finds its way. You could buy butter if you had money or goods to trade, but you paid in silence because the Germans did not tolerate this kind of activity. Neighbors lived in a careful balance of trust and suspicion. One day, someone might share potatoes with you, and the next, they might quietly report what you bought to the authorities. But life in occupied France was not only about food. There was also the matter of entertainment, of finding something, anything, that could keep the mind from drowning in fear. Theaters stayed open, surprisingly enough. German officers enjoyed French cinema and music, and they allowed plays and films to continue, though always censored. Some people went not because they loved the films, but because sitting in the dark gave them a moment of escape. Others refused, saying they would never give the enemy the satisfaction of their laughter. Still, there were evenings when a family sat around a radio, listening carefully, adjusting the knob, hoping to catch the distant, crackling signal of the BBC from London. If caught, punishment was harsh, yet the thrill of hearing the forbidden voice of free France was irresistible. Children, too, felt the strangeness of those years. Imagine being 10 years old, growing up with school lessons interrupted by air raid sirens, or with German soldiers marching past the playground. They still played games, still ran through the streets, still laughed, but they learned early to keep secrets. A careless word at dinner could bring trouble if repeated outside. And yet, children have resilience. They would chase each other in the alleys, kicking balls patched together with rags, pretending not to notice the tanks that rattled down the boulevards. There was beauty hidden beneath the weight of war. People still fell in love, even when the future felt uncertain. A young woman working at a market might meet a young man cycling past with baskets of vegetables strapped to his bike, and for a brief moment the world outside vanished. Love letters were passed in secret, scribbled quickly on scraps of paper, tucked inside books or slipped under doorways. To love in those times was an act of defiance. Every smile, every kiss stolen in a dark corner, said quietly, "Life continues, even here." At night, the city of Paris changed again. Streetlights were dimmed to prevent guiding enemy planes, and windows were painted or covered with heavy curtains. The silence after curfew was haunting. Only the sound of boots echoed on cobblestones, the heavy step of patrols making sure no one lingered outdoors. Yet behind closed doors, people whispered, candles lit, families gathered around small tables to talk, to remember what life had been before, and to dream of what it might be after. The rumors spread quickly in those days. Everyone knew someone who had seen a German convoy pass through, or someone who whispered of a resistance fighter caught, or of parachutes seen at night, carrying supplies from England. You never knew what was truth and what was exaggeration, but the stories gave people something to hold on to. They reminded everyone that the occupation, however heavy, was not forever. Think for a moment how strange it must have felt to live with two layers of reality at once. On the surface, you went about your day, shopping, cooking, working, nodding politely to soldiers, pretending that life was ordinary. But underneath, every glance, every step, every word carried meaning. You measured your movements carefully. You chose silence more often than speech. You laughed in public sometimes, but never too loudly. You trusted your family, your closest friends, and no one else. And still, the resilience of the French spirit was remarkable. Songs were sung, jokes were told, meals were shared, even if small. Hope was not erased. It was simply hidden, tucked away like a secret letter, waiting for the right moment to be opened again. The mornings in occupied towns often began with silence, broken only by the creak of shutters opening carefully and the faint rattle of a bicycle chain as someone pedaled toward the bakery. You could smell the faint trace of coffee substitutes drifting from kitchens, though real coffee was almost impossible to find. People roasted chicory roots or even ground acorns to make a bitter drink that only faintly reminded them of the aroma they once loved. For many families, the ritual mattered more than the taste. Holding a warm cup in cold hands gave a sense of normality, even when the world outside was anything but normal. In the countryside, the soundscape was different. Chickens clucked in small yards, dogs barked in bursts, and farmers carried heavy baskets down dirt paths to barter with neighbors. Life seemed slower there, but it was equally marked by fear. German soldiers patrolled the roads, sometimes polite, sometimes harsh, depending on the orders of the day. Villagers grew used to the sight of trucks rumbling past, carrying men in gray uniforms. Some waved reluctantly, others turned their backs, pretending to focus on the soil, the vines, or the cattle. It was safer to act busy, safer to appear invisible. The newspapers told another story. Every morning, neatly stacked copies appeared on street corners, filled with propaganda. Headlines spoke of German victories, of the new order in Europe, of the supposed futility of resistance. People read them because they had little choice, but most understood that every page was written under the watchful eye of censors. Between the lines, however, they searched for clues. Tiny signs, coded phrases, whispers of something beyond the official story. Sometimes, a single phrase tucked in a column could spark 100 rumors. The resistance was never a single army. It was a patchwork of people, men and women, young and old, who chose to fight in different ways. Some were daring, blowing up train lines under the cover of night, leaving behind nothing but a twisted stretch of iron. Others fought more quietly, forging papers, hiding families in barns or attics, or slipping messages inside loaves of bread. Even school teachers took part, teaching more than the curriculum allowed, reminding children in hushed tones of France's history, its poets, its heroes, its republic. Every small act carried risk, yet each one chipped at the silence the occupiers wanted to impose. And in homes across France, ordinary people practiced the art of listening without being heard. Radios, though restricted, remained a lifeline. At night, families drew curtains tightly, dimmed lamps, and leaned close as the static-filled voice from London cut through the air. "ICI Londres," it began. "This is London." The code words, often strange and poetic, carried secret instructions for fighters scattered across the country. To an outsider, they sounded like nonsense, but to those waiting, they were signals of hope. Fear was always present, a quiet shadow that followed people through their days. A knock at the door could freeze an entire household. Boots echoing in the stairwell might belong to a neighbor or to soldiers searching for someone. Collaborators lived among the population, some driven by survival, others by greed, others still by ideology. Their presence poisoned trust. You might share a meal with someone, laugh together, and only later discover that they had reported you. This uncertainty forced people to move carefully, to guard their words even in moments that once felt safe. And yet, life could not stop entirely. Markets opened, weddings were held, children were born. A bride might wear her mother's old dress, altered and patched, because fabric was scarce. Rings were borrowed, meals were small, but ceremonies still happened, and laughter still filled the air. In some way, joy itself was an act of quiet rebellion. By celebrating love, families declared that the occupiers had not stolen their future. Evenings brought their own rhythms. Cafes still served drinks, though the menus were thin. Wine was often diluted, beer brewed weak, and spirits stretched far beyond their usual strength. Still, people gathered, lowering their voices as German soldiers passed by, raising them again when the uniforms disappeared down the street. Musicians played, sometimes German-approved songs, but sometimes old French tunes slipped in, tunes that stirred memories of freer days. It was dangerous, but it reminded everyone that culture had not vanished. For children, the war was both frightening and oddly exciting. They collected shell casings as if they were treasures, stared wide-eyed at planes overhead, and sometimes even approached soldiers with the fearless curiosity only youth can afford. Some grew up faster than they should have, learning how to spot danger in a man's expression, or how to run quietly when patrols marched near. But they also found ways to carve out childhood. Skipping ropes, drawing with chalk, telling jokes in schoolyards. Life forced them to grow wise, but not entirely old. There were also the whispers of things unseen. People told stories of parachutists dropping from the sky, their silk chutes glowing like ghosts in the moonlight. They spoke of trains derailed in the night, of bridges collapsed, of German officials who vanished without explanation. Some of these stories were true, others imagined, but each one added to the web of mystery and courage that spread quietly across the land. Think of the balance people held in those years. One hand clinging to survival, the other reaching for dignity. Each day demanded choices, whether to risk helping a neighbor, whether to take more than your ration allowed, whether to speak out or to stay silent. Every gesture felt heavier because every gesture carried consequence. Yet through it all, people found ways to laugh, to share meals, to write letters, to fall in love, and to dream of the day when the gray uniforms would leave their streets. The networks of resistance were not always born from grand speeches or clear plans. Often, they began with something as simple as a friend passing a note, a farmer offering a hiding place, or a student deciding that silence had gone on long enough. Imagine a baker in a quiet village, hands covered with flour, slipping a small folded paper into the hollow of a loaf before delivering it to a trusted customer. To anyone else, it was bread. To the resistance, it was a message about troop movements or a warning of an upcoming raid. The courage it took to perform such a small action was immense, because discovery meant imprisonment, torture, or death. Yet, across France, countless individuals performed such acts daily. Universities were strange places under occupation. Young men and women still attended lectures, carrying books, scribbling notes, and preparing for examinations, but the atmosphere was heavy with unspoken defiance. Some professors cooperated, repeating the official lines, but others dropped subtle hints of resistance into their teaching. A passage from Victor Hugo, a poem by Verlaine, a reminder of France's revolutionary ideals. These became coded encouragements for students hungry for meaning beyond the walls of the classroom. In darkened apartments, groups of students gathered around candlelight, discussing leaflets, planning small demonstrations, dreaming of a France free from occupation. The countryside offered a different kind of resistance, one rooted in the land itself. Farmers hid fugitives in barns, dug pits beneath haystacks, or created false walls in stables. Shepherds led strangers along forgotten paths, guiding them toward the mountains or across borders. The terrain became both a weapon and a shield. Forests provided cover for guerrilla fighters, streams erased footprints, and the winding lanes of villages made pursuit difficult. Many of these farmers had never thought of themselves as soldiers, but in those years, the land they knew better than anyone else became a battlefield. And there was the railway. Trains were the lifeblood of the German war machine, carrying troops, weapons, and supplies across Europe. The resistance understood this, and so the tracks became targets. Men crept out at night with tools, loosening bolts, planting explosives, or spreading misinformation to send cargo to the wrong stations. A single act of sabotage could delay entire divisions, and yet the price was high. The Germans responded harshly, arresting entire villages if they suspected complicity. Still, the rails echoed not only with the rumble of steel wheels, but with the quiet defiance of those determined to disrupt them. Even priests and nuns found themselves drawn into the struggle. Churches, with their heavy doors and cool stone walls, became unlikely havens. Behind altars or beneath floors, refugees hid. Baptism certificates were altered, names changed, identities reinvented. For some clergy, it was a matter of faith, to protect the vulnerable, to shelter the hunted, to stand against injustice. For others, it was simply human decency. Yet every act carried danger, and many paid dearly when discovered. Rumors of Allied landings circulated constantly. People leaned in close at cafes, whispering that the British would arrive in weeks, that American planes were gathering across the Channel, that liberation was near. Time and again, the hopes rose and then fell, each rumor like a wave that lifted spirits before crashing down. But hope, even when false, was powerful. It reminded people that the occupation was temporary, that somewhere beyond the gray uniforms and propaganda posters, the world still fought on their behalf. Meanwhile, everyday survival remained a test of patience. Mothers patched the same dresses again and again, sewing over frayed seams until the fabric was more thread than cloth. Shoes were resoled with scraps of rubber. Wooden clogs returned to fashion, and children outgrew their clothes long before replacements could be found. Soap was made from whatever fats could be saved, giving it a harsh smell that clung to the skin. The simplest tasks, washing, cooking, repairing, became lessons in ingenuity. People learned to stretch, to substitute, to reinvent daily life with whatever was at hand. Entertainment persisted, though in altered forms. Music drifted from hidden rooms where gramophones played forbidden records, often jazz, a style the occupiers disapproved of but could not fully suppress. Dances were held quietly, with curtains drawn and windows closed, young people spinning in the dim glow of lanterns, laughing in whispers, pretending for a few hours that the world outside had not changed. These small gatherings were fragile bubbles of freedom, and yet they carried a weight far greater than their size. But danger was never far. The sight of posters announcing executions appeared overnight on walls, a reminder of what happened to those who defied the rules. Sometimes names were listed, sometimes only numbers, as if to strip away identity itself. People read them silently, standing in small clusters before moving quickly on. The fear was constant, yet the determination to endure ran deeper. What strikes me most about these years is not only the suffering but the way ordinary people carried themselves through it. They balanced on a line between despair and defiance, never fully surrendering, never fully free, but always holding on to something. A recipe remembered from better days, a song sung softly in kitchens, a glance exchanged in secret that meant more than words could. It was a life lived under shadows, but never without sparks of light. Paris under occupation was a city both familiar and unrecognizable. The Seine still curved gracefully beneath its bridges, the Eiffel Tower still rose above the skyline, and the boulevards still stretched wide and elegant. Yet everywhere, the presence of the occupiers was unavoidable. German flags draped across grand buildings, Soldiers in gray uniforms strolled arm in arm along the Champs-Élysées, and black cars with curtained windows rolled quietly through the avenues. For Parisians, it was as though their beloved city had been placed under glass. The architecture unchanged, but the atmosphere altered in every breath. Cafés, those famous meeting places of Parisian life, remained open but felt transformed. German officers often sat at tables near the windows, their boots polished, their cigarettes lit with careful precision. Ordinary Parisians occupied the other seats, pretending to read newspapers, sipping thin coffee, speaking quietly so as not to draw attention. Waiters moved gracefully between the two worlds, balancing trays while balancing their expressions, smiling politely to customers they served, but never too warmly, never too casually. To serve coffee to a neighbor was simple hospitality. To serve it to a soldier was survival. Fashion, too, adapted under the weight of shortages. Silk stockings vanished quickly from shops, replaced by women painting their legs with makeup or drawing lines down the backs to mimic seams. Dresses were shortened, jackets altered, old coats turned inside out to hide worn patches. Men wore suits longer than ever before, repairing them again and again until the fabric grew thin. Yet despite these limitations, Parisians carried themselves with a particular pride, an insistence on appearance that said, "We may be occupied, but we are not diminished." A red scarf, a carefully knotted tie, a dab of perfume. These became quiet symbols of defiance, gestures of dignity when all else felt fragile. The black market thrived in Paris as it did everywhere else, though in the city it carried an added sense of intrigue. In shadowy corners of Les Halles, or in whispered meetings on back streets, you could find butter, cheese, cigarettes, even chocolate smuggled from uncertain origins. Prices were outrageous, yet people paid, because sometimes a taste of sweetness mattered more than money itself. German patrols cracked down on these trades, but demand never disappeared. In fact, it seemed to grow stronger with every restriction imposed. The very act of buying black market goods became an act of resistance, a refusal to accept the bland diet of ration cards. Art and culture did not vanish, though they bent beneath censorship. Theaters staged plays, but scripts were carefully reviewed. Some artists chose to flatter the occupiers, hoping for protection or patronage. Others slid hidden meanings into their work, knowing that a single clever phrase could spark hope in the audience. Painters continued to paint, often in private, their canvases filled with images of freedom they dared not display publicly. Writers filled notebooks with words that might not be read until years later. Paris had always been a city of ideas, and even under occupation, the ideas did not die. They simply went underground. The city also became a stage for silent acts of defiance. On walls, small graffiti appeared at night. A cross of Lorraine, a symbol of free France, scrawled quickly before dawn. Leaflets fluttered from hands into gutters, carrying forbidden words. Students chalked slogans on sidewalks, erased by mourning but remembered by those who saw them. These gestures were dangerous, yet they created a sense of invisible connection. For a Parisian walking home in silence, seeing a small mark of resistance on a wall was enough to bring courage for another day. But the German presence was overwhelming. Soldiers lounged on park benches where lovers once kissed, guarded bridges with rifles slung casually over shoulders, and stood outside landmarks as if they were their own. Their voices filled the air, harsh German consonants clashing with the softer flow of French. To some Parisians, these sights were unbearable. To others, they became background noise, a constant hum one learned to live with. The tension was always there, though, an unspoken reminder that freedom had been stolen. And yet, life in Paris had its rhythms that could not be erased. People still strolled the boulevards, even if they walked more quickly. Children still fed pigeons in the squares, tossing crumbs with innocent joy. Couples still walked arm in arm by the river, whispering dreams that dared not leave the shadows. Markets bustled, though with fewer goods, their stalls lined with turnips, carrots, and whatever else could be grown or bartered. The city adapted because it had no choice, but it adapted with a strange kind of grace. There were also the darker sides, those who chose collaboration, who saw advantage in serving the occupiers. Some did it for survival, others for greed, others because they truly believed in the ideology being forced upon them. They lived more comfortably than their neighbors, eating better, dressing better, often despised in silence by those around them. But to speak against them was dangerous, for their ears were open, and their influence could reach far. Evenings in Paris were marked by blackout curtains and curfews. The city of light grew dim, its brilliance reduced to shadows. But within those shadows, gatherings took place. Friends whispering together, lovers meeting in secret, families sharing small meals while talking in low voices. Sometimes, laughter burst through despite the danger, a reminder that the human spirit bends but does not break. The soul of Paris was not extinguished. It lingered in the taste of wine, however thin, in the notes of an accordion played on a quiet street, in the way the Seine reflected the moonlight, reminding everyone that some things remained unchanged no matter how heavy the boots that marched upon its bridges. Life under occupation carried a constant weight that pressed not only on bodies but on minds, a subtle exhaustion that never fully disappeared. People walked the streets with heads lowered, not always out of fear but out of habit, learning over time to measure every glance and every word. Neighbors became observers of one another, noting who smiled too much at a passing soldier, who lingered too long in conversation, who seemed to whisper to themselves at night. Trust became rare, and yet it remained precious, for some friendships endured despite the shadows of suspicion. Old bonds were strengthened when shared quietly, while new ones were forged in moments of risk, in passing information, in offering shelter, or even in exchanging food no one had the right to share. Families adapted in ways that might seem unusual now. Kitchens were not only places of cooking but of strategy. Mothers, fathers, and even children learned to ration carefully, to hide supplies in clever compartments, to trade discreetly with neighbors. Sometimes a single onion became the centerpiece of a meal, cooked slowly to release flavor. Other times, a handful of dried beans or a bit of stale bread stretched to create a stew that fed more than one hungry mouth. Meals were eaten quickly, sometimes in silence, because the fear of being overheard lingered. Yet in other moments, food became a small joy, a reason to gather and whisper, laugh quietly, or recount stories from before the war. Stories that reminded everyone of a life that still existed somewhere beyond these gray streets. Betrayals were never far. Someone you trusted might decide to collaborate, might trade information for safety or gain, and the consequences rippled through communities. Families learned to keep secrets from one another, even as they shared their most pressing worries. A whispered comment, an absent friend, a letter unreceived, all became potential signs of danger. And yet, amid this web of uncertainty, acts of loyalty were equally remarkable. People risked imprisonment to deliver messages, to smuggle food, to shelter fugitives. Every small act of courage was magnified by the constant presence of threat. A single wrong move could undo weeks or months of careful planning. Children, perhaps surprisingly, adapted faster than adults. They learned to identify dangers instinctively, to recognize patterns in the soldiers' movements, to notice subtle changes in neighbors' behavior. Yet they also retained an astonishing capacity for play. Boys and girls chased each other in alleys, hid behind carts, and imagined worlds far beyond the gray stones of their towns. They drew with chalk on sidewalks, built makeshift toys, and whispered fantastical stories to one another. In their laughter and ingenuity, the adults found comfort, a reminder that life could still exist in forms untainted by fear, even if only briefly. The nights brought both solace and terror. Curtains drawn, lamps dimmed, families gathered to read, write letters, or simply speak in low voices. Sometimes the only sound was the wind, or the faint echo of soldiers' boots. Occasionally, Distant planes droned overhead, and people held their breath, unsure whether to hope or to worry. And always, there was the knowledge that news, when it came, could be both uplifting and devastating. Radio broadcasts from London whispered rumors of resistance victories, sightings of parachutists, or reports of local betrayals. Each carried weight, and each demanded careful judgment about who could hear what was known. At the edges of towns and villages, the landscape of resistance took shape more visibly. Hidden caches of supplies, secret meeting points, and trails through forests became crucial. Farmers, shepherds, and villagers played essential roles, guiding strangers to safety, alerting others to patrols, or simply providing a safe place to rest. Even ordinary objects could become tools of survival: a hollow log to hide messages, a barn loft to conceal a refugee, a false partition in a stable that could make the difference between life and death. The countryside, for all its serenity, was alive with secret activity, with danger, and with courage. The emotional tension was relentless. People felt guilt for surviving when others did not, fear for taking risks that might expose them or their families, and grief for those lost to execution, arrest, or deportation. Yet amid the fear, laughter persisted, and hope persisted, fragile as a candle flame flickering in the wind but unextinguished. Conversations, whispered late at night, carried coded meanings. Friends and relatives learned to speak with subtext, to read between lines, to recognize danger in a sigh or a glance. Evenings sometimes offered glimpses of forbidden joy. Music played softly in hidden apartments, accordion notes drifting up from quiet courtyards. Lovers met discreetly, embracing in shadowed corners, exchanging messages in handwriting that might be destroyed the next day. Families shared meals, telling stories of holidays and birthdays long past, imagining the future in quiet voices that were half dreams, half prayers. To live, even for a moment, as if the occupation were only a temporary pause, was an act of courage itself. In all these ways, life in occupied France continued, fragile and precarious, yet alive. Every loaf of bread, every hidden letter, every whispered rumor, every act of defiance, small or large, was part of the story of survival, resilience, and courage. People carried on, walking the line between fear and hope, knowing that tomorrow would bring new challenges, new choices, and new opportunities to endure. Resistance work was not always dramatic in the way stories might make it seem. Often, it began with subtle gestures, nearly invisible to the casual observer. A shopkeeper might place a note beneath a loaf of bread, a child might carry a folded message in the lining of a coat, or a farmer might signal the approach of soldiers with a simple flag hung at a window. These small acts, almost ordinary, held immense significance. One misstep could lead to capture, yet these gestures were repeated daily, forming a network that stretched across towns, villages, and forests. The people who performed them understood the risk, and the weight of their courage was invisible to everyone except those who participated. Trains, which rumbled across the countryside carrying soldiers and supplies, were frequent targets of sabotage. Resistance fighters often worked at night, loosening bolts on rails, greasing wheels to create friction, or removing sections of track to delay the German war machine. Sometimes explosives were used, planted with precise timing so as to avoid civilian casualties, but the work was never without danger. Guards were vigilant, patrols increased after every incident, and even a small mistake could reveal the entire network. And yet, the disruptions, however minor, spread fear among the occupiers and boosted morale among the French, a reminder that defiance persisted in places the Germans thought secure. Espionage took many forms. Ordinary citizens became unwitting or willing participants, memorizing numbers, names, and routes, then reciting them quietly to trusted messengers. A grocer might note the comings and goings of German officers, recording small details in a ledger that appeared ordinary but carried secrets vital to the resistance. Teachers whispered news to students in ways that seemed innocent to any outsider, ensuring that information reached those who could act on it. Each of these acts demanded nerves of steel. Being discovered meant immediate danger, often leaving families bereft. Life in the city and the countryside overlapped in strange ways. A message passed in Paris might eventually reach a farmhouse in Normandy, carried on foot or bicycle, through forests and fields where danger was never far. People grew accustomed to traveling at night, moving silently, listening to the wind, the rustle of leaves, the distant echo of vehicles on gravel roads. Every sound demanded attention. A dropped tin can, a snapping twig, a cough, all could betray a traveler. Yet the networks endured because the people involved believed in the cause more than they feared the consequences. Daily life still pressed on, even amid these dangers. Women prepared meals with ingredients that were often scarce, improvising to stretch rations into full dinners. A handful of potatoes might be baked and shared with several neighbors, a single egg stretched into an omelet by careful technique. Families preserved fruits and vegetables in jars, creating stores for winter months, while children helped wherever possible, learning early how survival depended on skill, patience, and resourcefulness. Cooking became a quiet art of resistance itself, nourishing both body and spirit. Evenings offered moments of both tension and relief. Curfews forced the population indoors, yet hidden gatherings occurred in private apartments, where music could be played softly and conversation flowed with coded meanings. Lovers met in secret, exchanging letters folded multiple times to hide their content. Stories were told, some true, some exaggerated, but each one carried a lesson or a spark of hope. It was a time when laughter could be dangerous yet priceless, when even a shared glance across a candlelit table became an affirmation of life and resistance. The psychological burden was immense. People lived with constant uncertainty. Was the neighbor trustworthy? Would the patrols notice a missing loaf or a hidden note? Would the next day bring arrest, deportation, or violence? And yet, despite fear, courage persisted. People adapted, creating routines that allowed survival. Signals on doors, hidden compartments in furniture, secret meeting points in forests or abandoned buildings. Each measure was small, but collectively they formed a web of resilience, a fragile yet vital structure holding communities together. Rumors traveled quickly, carrying both hope and dread. Word of parachutists landing in nearby fields might spread in hours, inspiring excitement and careful planning. Conversely, news of raids or executions sent shockwaves through towns, prompting families to hide, to move silently, to double-check their hiding places. Every report required interpretation, filtering truth from exaggeration, and the ability to act quickly could mean life or death. And yet, in the midst of danger, people found ways to persist. Markets continued, streets were walked, cafes served coffee, and families still shared meals. Ordinary life intertwined with extraordinary courage, producing a rhythm unique to those times. Every decision mattered, every choice carried weight, and every small act, whether of survival, defiance, or care, formed part of the ongoing story of France under occupation, a story that moved quietly, steadily, and with remarkable endurance. In the cities, subtle sabotage became an art form, blending into the ordinary rhythm of life. A tram might fail mysteriously, not by chance but through careful intervention by someone who understood the mechanics better than anyone suspected. Street lamps sometimes flickered out at night, not because of faulty wiring, but because someone had temporarily disrupted the circuits. Workers in factories or warehouses left tools misplaced or applied small but critical errors that slowed production without drawing immediate suspicion. These acts were often invisible to outsiders, but to those who knew their meaning, they were powerful gestures of defiance. Espionage relied on the same principle, invisibility masked by normalcy. Couriers traveled by foot or bicycle, blending into market crowds or rush-hour pedestrians. Every detail mattered: the way a package was carried, the timing of a meeting, the careful avoidance of direct eye contact with soldiers. Even a simple gesture, like a hand on a hat or the angle of a glance, could convey complex instructions. Ordinary citizens became operatives without realizing it, their daily tasks layered with secret significance. The thrill of success was tempered by the ever-present risk of capture, a tension that infused every small act with life and death stakes. And yet, life could not stop. Cafes continued to hum with quiet conversation. Waiters memorized orders for regulars while subtly observing for signs of danger. Shops opened early, sometimes displaying a single loaf of bread, a few vegetables, or the faint glimmer of forbidden goods. People moved carefully, polite smiles masking a constant awareness. Even the act of walking from one street to another demanded vigilance, for the watchful eyes of soldiers or informants could be anywhere. Each day was a negotiation between normalcy and survival, and each success, however small, was a victory. Children's lives remained oddly resilient. They found ways to play amidst curfews, rationing, and the constant presence of soldiers. They crafted toys from scraps, ran races along alleys, and whispered stories of imagined battles, drawing strength from their ability to create worlds beyond the gray streets. For adults, the laughter of children offered a reminder of what was worth protecting, a fragile but powerful reassurance that life endured even in the shadow of fear. Teachers and mentors added another layer of resistance, weaving coded messages into lessons, sharing forbidden stories, and nurturing minds that could see beyond occupation. Knowledge itself became a weapon, a seed planted quietly but with long-reaching effects. The countryside maintained its own rhythms of defiance. Forests were mapped in secret, hiding spots memorized and reinforced. Rivers and streams became covert routes for messages and people, paths invisible to the untrained eye. Farmers prepared caches of food and supplies, sometimes for neighbors, sometimes for fugitives, always with the awareness that discovery could be fatal. Paths that had been walked for generations became secret channels of survival, carrying men, women, and children toward safety or toward their next mission. The land itself seemed to collaborate with the resistance, offering cover and disguise where it could. Everywhere, people found moments to reclaim a sense of normalcy. Music drifted from apartments, sometimes approved German marches, sometimes forbidden jazz or classical pieces that reminded listeners of freedom and culture before the occupation. Lovers met in hidden corners, whispering words that could never be spoken aloud in public. Families gathered around small, dimly lit tables, sharing meager meals but preserving stories, laughter, and hope. Even the act of reading a book, carefully turned page by page, became a small rebellion against the dullness imposed by fear and restriction. Fear, however, was never far. A sudden knock at the door, a soldier lingering too long in a courtyard, a neighbor's gaze held a fraction too long. All were reminders that the safety of the moment was temporary. Arrests happened quickly, often without warning. Those who disappeared left behind questions, grief, and a palpable sense of fragility that haunted every home. And yet, despite the omnipresent threat, courage persisted in countless forms, large and small. A loaf of bread hidden, a message delivered, a life saved, or even the simple decision to smile and live despite the circumstances. Rumors of resistance victories reached towns and villages sporadically. A burned train here, a sabotaged bridge there, whispers of parachutes dropping supplies at night. They arrived like fragmented stories, sometimes exaggerated, sometimes understated, yet always enough to remind people that they were not alone. Allies existed beyond the horizon, invisible but present, and the knowledge offered both comfort and direction. Every rumor, every sign, every coded message fed a quiet network of hope that moved across France, even as boots and shadows patrolled the streets. In all of this, life flowed like a tense river, carrying danger, courage, hope, and despair in equal measure. People adapted, survived, and resisted in ways both visible and invisible. Their days were measured in rationed meals, whispered conversations, secret deliveries, coded messages, and fleeting moments of joy. Their nights were lived in shadow, listening, planning, hoping. And through it all, they endured, weaving a story of survival that was as intricate as it was quiet. A narrative that would later be remembered not in grand parades, but in the small acts that sustained humanity under occupation. In many households, the war was experienced not only in the streets or forests, but in the intimate spaces of kitchens, bedrooms, and attics. Families learned quickly to speak in whispers, to hide belongings in false bottoms of drawers, and to ration not only food but words. Children became unusually observant, noting the slightest changes in expression on a parent's face, the tone of a neighbor's greeting, or the presence of unfamiliar vehicles. Every day carried decisions: whom to trust, what to say, and when to remain silent. The weight of such choices pressed heavily, yet families found ways to maintain a semblance of normality, laughing softly over shared meals or recounting stories from the past that seemed almost distant now, like memories from another life. Take, for example, a small family in a provincial town. The father, once a clerk in a bustling office, now spent his mornings delivering supplies to neighbors under the guise of errands. He memorized patrol schedules, routes, and the faces of soldiers so that he could avoid trouble while still assisting the resistance. His wife, skilled with needle and thread, patched clothes for the family, repaired torn uniforms, and altered garments for neighbors, all while hiding messages sewn into hems or lining. Their children, who should have been carefree, helped discreetly, running small errands, observing movements, and learning the careful art of discretion. Each member of the household contributed, not out of heroism in the grand sense, but out of survival, love, and a quiet commitment to what was right. In urban apartments, life took on another rhythm. Tenants moved cautiously through narrow stairwells, passing along whispered news or small parcels. One young woman memorized German patrol schedules and relayed them to resistance operatives, risking her own safety each time. Her neighbor, an elderly man, hid radios that carried broadcasts from London, allowing those who could listen a glimpse of a world beyond the occupation. A baker's apprentice might notice patterns in delivery routes and subtly leave packages where they were needed. These acts, seemingly mundane, were lifelines. Each small contribution, unnoticed by the untrained eye, sustained a larger network of defiance. Meals were modest, but every preparation held significance. In some homes, a single potato might be roasted and shared, the skin scraped carefully so nothing went to waste. Soup often consisted of thin broth with scattered vegetables, yet families shared it together, turning the act of eating into a quiet ritual of unity. Preserving food became an art. Jars of fruit, cans of beans, and scraps of meat were stored, hidden in attics, behind floorboards, or beneath false compartments in cupboards. Every meal was a negotiation between necessity and ingenuity, a lesson in resilience and creativity. Entertainment persisted despite scarcity. Children played quietly in alleys or courtyards, making toys from scraps, running races, and inventing games that drew them briefly out of the shadow of fear. Adults found solace in music, reading, and whispered storytelling. In Paris, hidden gatherings in apartments allowed people to hear forbidden jazz or classical pieces, while in villages, folk songs were shared among neighbors, maintaining culture and identity in the face of occupation. Laughter, soft and fleeting, became a kind of defiance. Even a joke told quietly over a modest dinner was an act of rebellion, a refusal to be entirely subdued by fear. Fear remained omnipresent. The knock of boots on a stairwell, the unexpected appearance of soldiers, or the sudden disappearance of a neighbor could unsettle entire families. Arrests and deportations cast long shadows. People learned to read signs, to anticipate danger, and to prepare for the worst without allowing despair to dominate. Yet amid the tension, courage blossomed in quiet ways. A child might hide a letter in a bread basket. A mother might conceal food or medicine for someone in need. A neighbor might risk their safety to warn others of patrols. Every gesture, however small, was magnified by context, turning ordinary acts into extraordinary bravery. Rumors and whispers carried information, hope, and dread in equal measure. News of parachutists, sabotage trains, or victories abroad reached towns and villages slowly, often distorted. Yet each nugget of truth reinforced the sense that ordinary people could influence events. Conversely, word of raids, arrests, or betrayals spread fear, teaching everyone to move carefully, speak sparingly, and trust cautiously. The emotional load was immense, yet it was shared, binding communities together even as the occupation sought to divide them. Through all of this, the human spirit endured. Families adapted, children grew perceptive and cautious, neighbors collaborated carefully, and resistance networks persisted. Daily life was a continuous negotiation between survival and defiance, fear and courage, despair and hope. Ordinary acts, sharing a meal, delivering a message, playing quietly, hiding a neighbor, became extraordinary in the context of danger. In the shadow of occupation, people discovered the depth of endurance, the value of subtle courage, and the importance of small, persistent acts of humanity. In one small town tucked between hills and rivers, the lives of ordinary families reflected both the endurance and ingenuity demanded by occupation. A widow with 2 children, for example, transformed her modest apartment into a hub of discreet activity. By day, she managed to obtain scarce ingredients at the market, exchanging scraps of fabric or bread for vegetables, cheese, or milk. By night, she concealed messages under floorboards, ensuring that local resistance fighters received instructions or warnings. Her children played quietly in the shadows, carrying small parcels or watching for strangers, learning early the value of observation and caution. Every small act was intertwined with a sense of moral duty. The line between survival and courage blurred, becoming almost indistinguishable. Neighbors observed one another in ways that could seem ordinary yet carried enormous consequences. A baker might notice a new face lingering near the shop, a sudden hesitation in a customer's steps, or the angle of a soldier's gaze. These small observations were reported quietly, sometimes through a signal like a flower placed in a window or a specific arrangement of chairs outside a cafe. Such subtleties were the language of resistance, and mastering them meant the difference between life and death. Trust was scarce and precious, and every gesture, every glance, every word could carry hidden meaning. Even in moments of apparent routine, danger lingered. Mothers patched clothes while keeping one ear attuned to distant footsteps. Children quietly completed their studies under candlelight, knowing that a loud cough or a careless question might bring an unwelcome visitor. Meals were prepared with frugality and creativity. Soup stretched with bits of potato and herbs, bread baked from a mix of grains scavenged from various sources, and meat rationed so sparingly that every bite was savored. Yet within these modest routines, families found moments of connection, comfort, and quiet joy, turning the act of surviving into a daily testament to resilience. Urban life offered its own forms of tension and ingenuity. Apartment buildings became miniature microcosms of occupation, where residents coordinated movements, shared news, and hid resources. A young student might memorize the schedules of German patrols while delivering packages for neighbors. A seamstress could hide messages in the hems of dresses or the linings of coats, passing intelligence along unnoticed. Even the smallest mistakes carried consequences, yet ordinary people adapted, turning daily routines into carefully orchestrated strategies that blended seamlessly with life under occupation. Entertainment and culture persisted as lifelines. Music drifted softly from rooms where gramophones played jazz or classical compositions forbidden by the occupiers. In villages, children sang folk songs, their voices carrying across fields, while families shared stories of holidays, birthdays, or legends from generations past. A joke, a playful game, or even a whispered anecdote became a rebellion against the dullness and fear imposed by occupation. These small joys were fragile yet vital, reminders that life, however constrained, retained its essence. The psychological strain was constant. Families lived in anticipation of raids, arrests, and deportations. The sudden absence of a neighbor, the disappearance of a distant cousin, or the news of a local execution could ripple through households, leaving everyone unsettled. Yet amid the fear, courage endured in countless forms. Hiding food or supplies for someone in need, warning neighbors of patrols, delivering messages at night, or simply maintaining normal routines to preserve a sense of stability. Each act, small or large, was an assertion of humanity in a world where fear sought to dominate. Rumors carried both hope and dread, moving swiftly through towns and villages. News of Allied victories, parachutists landing, or sabotage operations spread excitement and planning, while reports of arrests or betrayals reminded people of the constant risks. Each story, each whisper required discernment, for acting on the wrong information could be fatal. Yet the network of shared knowledge, trust, and subtle communication strengthened communities, allowing ordinary people to navigate the impossible circumstances of their daily lives. Evenings brought moments of fragile peace. Families gathered around simple meals, talking in low voices, reading from worn books, or playing quiet games. Lovers met discreetly, exchanging notes or fleeting glances. Children slept in rooms where whispers of news, laughter, or cautionary tales floated above them. In these moments, the weight of occupation persisted but did not completely overshadow life. The ordinary became extraordinary, each act of care, observation, or subtle defiance forming a narrative of endurance, courage, and quiet resistance that defined life in occupied France. Across France, hidden networks stretched from the cities into the countryside, linking ordinary citizens to resistance operatives in ways that were almost invisible yet crucial. Couriers traveled by night, cycling along narrow paths, slipping through forests, or walking quietly along deserted roads, carrying messages that could alter the fate of towns. Each journey was fraught with danger. A snapped twig, a distant shout, or the glint of a soldier's helmet could betray their presence. Yet these men and women persisted, guided by knowledge, instinct, and the urgent sense that every message mattered. Even the simplest errors, a forgotten turn, a misread signal, could have catastrophic consequences, and still ordinary people learned to navigate these hidden channels with remarkable precision. In villages, ordinary homes became waypoints. A barn loft, an attic, or a hidden cupboard provided shelter for fugitives or a temporary stop for couriers. Families, already stretched thin by scarcity, now carried the additional burden of secrecy. They learned to read patterns in their surroundings, to note unusual activity in neighbors' behavior, and to communicate with subtle gestures. A flower in a window, a candle left burning in a particular way, or a chair placed in a specific position could all convey crucial information. These acts, invisible to the occupiers, formed an intricate language of survival, connecting towns and cities through a web of quiet courage. Meanwhile, life in Paris continued its delicate dance between fear and resilience. Cafes and markets operated under scrutiny, yet patrons and shopkeepers maintained routines with almost ritualistic care. A baker might quietly hide a rationed egg beneath flour for a neighbor, or a fruit seller might arrange apples in a way that signaled the arrival of a courier. Music drifted softly from apartments, sometimes jazz, sometimes classical, always an assertion of culture and identity under the shadow of occupation. Laughter, soft and fleeting, became a form of defiance, and even a simple shared meal could carry enormous significance. Children grew remarkably observant. Playing quietly, they absorbed lessons that extended beyond schoolbooks. How to recognize danger, whom to trust, and how to act with caution. Yet they also found moments of play that were almost normal. Running in courtyards, inventing games from scraps, or whispering stories that carried them far from the gray streets. Their laughter was rare but priceless, a small yet persistent reminder that life could continue even in constrained circumstances. Rural areas carried a unique rhythm. Fields and forests provided both resources and refuge, but navigating them demanded skill. Farmers and shepherds guided couriers, concealed fugitives, or hid supplies in ways that blended seamlessly into the landscape. Every hidden path, every camouflaged cache was a lifeline. Rivers became routes for messages, forests a maze of safe passage. Even ordinary objects, a hollowed log, a false partition in a barn, a pile of hay, could conceal critical secrets. Survival depended not only on courage but also on ingenuity, and every day was a test of both. Despite the constant threat, families adapted to maintain a sense of continuity. Meals were prepared carefully, stretching limited ingredients to nourish as many as possible. A handful of potatoes, a few leaves of cabbage, or a bit of dried meat was transformed into a dish that fed more than one mouth, often with clever seasoning or improvisation. Kitchens became sites of strategy as well as sustenance, where survival was measured not just in calories but in the quiet management of danger, observation, and secrecy. Evenings brought both tension and fleeting peace. Curfews forced the population indoors, yet hidden gatherings allowed music, conversation, and even laughter to survive. Lovers met discreetly, children played quietly, and families shared moments of comfort in simple routines. Each action, however small, was layered with meaning. A hidden glance, a whispered warning, a carefully folded letter. In occupied France, the ordinary became extraordinary. Every gesture a small rebellion, every survival a quiet triumph. Rumors, both real and imagined, traveled quickly. News of resistance successes inspired hope, while stories of arrests or executions reminded everyone of the stakes. Each person had to weigh information carefully, decide whom to trust, and act in ways that balanced risk and necessity. Through it all, the fabric of daily life continued to weave itself, blending fear, courage, hope, and resilience into a single, intricate story that would define this period for generations to come.